For the next 12 minutes, allow my teammates Prateek Singh, Michael Yang, and me, Anurag Katakar, to walk you through an immersive and interactive visualization and exploration of a data set of the top 250 transfers over the last 20 years of club football. With this data set, we aim to answer the questions: which are the most lucrative positions? Which positions are transferred most often? Which are the richest teams and leagues in football? And how often do actual transfer fees come close to the market value of a player? And are there any identifiable trends with respect to these two quantities?
That's the kickoff whistle, and let's begin. Before we answer the questions, let's familiarize ourselves with the dataset. Skipping through the analysis of the data quality, let's look at the different variables in our dataset one by one. Coming on to age of the different players, we find the age to follow a bell-shaped distribution with a mean of around 25 years and a standard deviation of 3 years. It's evident that most of the players lie in the age group of 20 and 27 years, with very few players above 30 years. Looking at the market value distribution, we find this distribution to be highly right skewed, with a long tail of outliers who are valued very highly, and most of the players being valued under 20 million euros. Looking at the distribution of transfer fees, which is basically the actual amount of Looking at the distribution of transfer fees, which is basically the actual amount that's exchanged between the different teams or leagues while transferring players, we see this distribution to be even more right skewed than the market value, with a long tail of outliers who are transferred for a very large amount, with most of the players being transferred under a value of 20 million euros. Coming to transfer count for different positions, we found the position counts to vary very significantly with positions, with most of the transfers centered around center forward, center back, and midfields, and whereas very few positions with for sweeper, defender, and midfielder. As a part of the data cleaning, we subsumed these four labels into the center forward, center back, and center midfield categories. During our analysis for the dataset, we found the transfer counts for few seasons to be missing. However, we still proceeded with analysis of the data for the following reasons. First of all, the magnitude of the missing data was very small. Secondly, there was no obvious reason why the data was missing in a non-random fashion. And finally, our questions were not sensitive to such small differences in the dataset. Let's move on to answering our questions.
Now we turn our attention to the data exploration page. In this page, we'll answer the 4 questions that we had set earlier. The first question is, which are the most lucrative positions in transfers? In this figure, we see each of the positions and the size of the dot corresponds to the average transfer fee over the entire period. We see that because the dot size are relatively similar, on average, transfer values are relatively even across positions. The player in each of these dots is the most expensive transferred. So for the right winger, Kylian Mbappe was the most expensive transfer of 135 million euros in the 2018 to 2019 season. However, looking at the distribution of transfer fee by position, we see that star players in attacking positions are worth more than star players in defending positions. We see that here in the left side of the image where the attacking players are pictured compared to the right side of the image where the defending players are pictured. Now let's turn to our second question. Which positions are transferred most often? In this area chart, we show the number of transfers per season for all of the different positions. We see that there are fewer transfers for left and right side specialists, as the greatest number of transfers belong to center forward, center back, and center midfield positions. And there is an even distribution up and down the pitch. One way we can use this chart is by using the filtering option. So let's see how the midfield positions are distributed. Here we've selected the 5 different midfield positions. We see that the greatest number of transfers belong to central midfield, attacking midfield, and defensive midfield. And as we discussed earlier, the left and right positions are the fewest.
Next, let us answer the question of which are the richest teams and leagues in football. First, let's have a look at the leagues. The bubble plots here have two attributes. The size represents the amount of money transferred into or out of a league, and the color represents the number of transfers. Based on the transfers into a league, we see that several top tier European leagues happen to be the biggest spenders and the ones who buy the most number of players. In contrast, we see that the spread of players being transferred out of leagues is more uniform, which leads us to the conclusion that there is a net inflow of players into top tier 1 European leagues.
Following on from the bubble chart, if we add edges to the above graph, we get this network graph. And the main observations that we can infer from this graph are that most of the transfers are performed by the small fraction of rich leagues, which are in the center of the network, while those in the periphery are involved with just a very few transfers. Also, amongst these rich leagues, there is a high degree of interconnectivity, showing that there is a high amount of transfers between these leagues.
Looking at the expenditure over time, we see that the Premier League is the top spender very consistently. Premier League has been the top spender in every season since 2002 to 2003. For the second and third positions, La Liga of Spain and Serie A of Italy generally jostle for those positions, while the French League, Ligue 1, Bundesliga, the German League, and Premier Liga, the Russian League, follow on in positions 4 to 6. Now looking at the transfer counts at the team level, the following chart shows that the transfers at the team level follow a Pareto distribution. As expected, the teams involved in the most transfer do belong to the Tier 1 European leagues.
Finally, let us try to answer the question of how often do actual transfer fees come close to the market value of a player, and if at all there exist any identifiable trends with respect to these two quantities. On the left, we have a scatter plot of every single transfer in our data set. The x-axis is the market value, and the y-axis are the transfer fees. The dotted line represents a reference line where market value equals transfer value. Just from simply looking at the scatter plot, we can identify that a majority of the transfers lie above the reference line, which indicates that most of the players are frequently undervalued. Further, we can identify that of the players that lie above the reference line, most are very young in age, as represented by the blue color. In contrast, those transfers below the reference line are more often red, which signifies that the players who are older are overvalued. Further, this visualization allows us to filter these players by buyers, as shown on the right-hand side of the plot with the bar chart. Selecting the first biggest buyer, which happens to be Chelsea, we see a corresponding change in the scatter plot on the left. And here we see that most of the transfers are, again, above the line and blue in color. This shows us that Chelsea, unfortunately, more often pays more for a player than may be necessary. Filtering by sellers, We can see that Monaco happens to be uh, the biggest seller. Following the same trend, we can perhaps comment that Monaco is more savvy at valuing its players, which lets it sell most of its players at transfer fees higher than their market values. The last FIFA World Cup, which was held in 2018, had a global viewership of 3.8 billion people, which is almost 50% of the world population. Club football also has a similar amount of traction the world over. This data set and its exploration and the visualizations that we presented here was our humble attempt at gaining an insight into this highly dynamic environment of football transfers. Thank you for joining us for this visualization of football transfers over the years. Signing off are your commentators Anurag Katakkar,
Prateek Singh,
and Michael Yang.